بدل صحيح في شوية هذا
Can we start?
Start.
Welcome to session 7 of the conference. The theme of this session is Future Prospects of the Palestinian Cause, Legal, Political, and International Perspectives. We are very delighted to have with us 3 distinguished speakers. One of them couldn't be with us, so he will join us through FaceTime. So he is connected now. So Dr. Chaha will introduce him at the top of the moment. Dr. Omar Chaha is our moderator. Dr. Chaha is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Istanbul Zain University here. His areas of research include women's movement, political theory, and theory of democracy. Dr. Chaha has many books and publications in English and Turkish, including Women and Civil Society in Turkey, Women's Movements in Muslim Society, Glass Ceiling Syndrome in Turkey, Political Ideologies in Turkey and the World, Women in Changing World, and many other books. Dr. Chaha also co-edited several volumes, including Family in the World and in Turkey, and Process of EU Enlargement in the 21st Century, New Challenges. Please welcome Dr. Omar Chaha.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great pleasure for me to open the second session of this important conference. The title of this session is The Future Prospects of the Palestinian Cause, Legal, Political, and International Perspectives. We have 3 distinguished speakers. One of them will not be able to be with us, unfortunately, and he will connect through Skype. So I would like to present the speakers. The first speaker is Professor John Quigley. He is the Professor Emeritus at the Morris College of Law of the Ohio University in Columbus. He is a specialist in public international law and the law of human rights. He writes extensively on legal issues related to the Palestinian question. His books cover key issues in the conflict over the Palestine and include the following: international diplomacy of Israel's founders, deception at the United Nations in the quest of Palestine, the Six-Day War and Israeli self-defense, questioning the legal basis for preventive war, the status of Palestine, international law in the Middle East conflict, and the case for Palestine, an international law perspective. The title of Professor Quigley's presentation is Framing the Conflict from the Perspective of International Law. So the second distinguished speaker is Dr. Moin Rabbani. He is an independent analyst, commentator and researcher specializing in Palestinian affairs and the Arab-Israel conflict. He has previously served as the principal political affairs officer with the Office of the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, head of Middle East with Crisis Management Initiative Center, senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Rabbani is also co-editor of Jadaliyya, contributing editor of Middle East Report, senior fellow with the Institute for Palestine Studies, associate fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He's a graduate of Tufts University and Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. The title of Dr. Rabbani's presentation is Trump and Palestine, Continuity and Change in the U.S. Policy. And the third distinguished speaker is Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He's a political scientist and scholar of the Middle East who focuses on the question of Israel-Palestine. Dr. Finkelstein received his PhD from Princeton University in 1988, and he is the author of 10 books that have been translated into many different languages, including the Holocaust industry, reflections on the exploitation of Jewish suffering, and most recently, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. He has held faculty positions at Brooklyn College, Rhodesia University, Hunter College, New York University, and DePaul University, where he was an assistant professor from 2001 to 2007. The title of Dr. Finkelstein's presentation is The Future of Gaza and the Occupation, What Happens Next. As I said, he will not be able to participate here, but he will connect through Skype. Oh, he's actually here. Oh, you're welcome, Dr. Finkelstein. I hope you are okay.
I'm fine, thank you.
Nice to meet you. Okay, so I think he will be the third speaker. So we are now to start with Professor John Quigley. The floor is yours. We have about 23 minutes. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this audible in that? Is this good? Yeah. At this point, I think we have something of a dilemma, because we heard from Dr. Ilan Pape, who said that international law has nothing to say about settler colonialism. Yet this morning we heard from our theologians, and if you listen carefully, they mentioned justice and they mentioned international law as something incorporated within their theologies. So we have to figure out whether there's truth to what Dr. Pape said, truth to what the theologians said, and as you'll see, my answer, perhaps a diplomatic answer, is that there's some truth to both perspectives on the matter. It's an issue that, as I was thinking about this, reminded me of discussions I had with Edward Said on the same subject. Edward was very skeptical about international law, whether the institutions of international law would provide a solution for Palestine. But at the same time, whenever I would talk with him about different processes that were going on, he was always very interested. So I think he had perhaps an ambivalent view of the matter. But on settler colonialism, I think there are some places where you see international law dealing with the subject. You do have the International Convention on the Crime of Apartheid that was adopted in response to the situation in South Africa. And at that same historical period, you had the Security Council of the United Nations dealing with the Unilateral Declaration of Independence in Rhodesia, where you had a European settler minority group that was declaring independence from Britain with the premise that they would have a state in which only the settlers were represented and only the settlers would have the right to vote. And the Security Council responded to that with a set of very significant economic sanctions that were maintained for a period of years. So I do think there is some precedent in United Nations practice for dealing with settler colonialism. At the same time, Palestine has not been treated well by the international institutions. If you want to go back to the Balfour Declaration and its incorporation into the Palestine Mandate, which was a clear infringement on self-determination of the population of Palestine, you had the British government entering into that process for reasons of its own, issuing the Balfour Declaration for reasons that fundamentally were related to trying to win the war against Germany and had nothing to do with the situation in Palestine in the sense of being good or bad. That was a matter of indifference, I think, to the British government. And the British government then had to make make itself accountable to the League of Nations, which devised the system of mandates for Palestine, for Iraq, and for Syria. And in that process, the British government, committed prevarication, I'll say, to say it politely, for a period of years, trying to convince the Permanent Mandates Commission that the situation in Palestine was going well, that the two population groups could get along, that Jewish immigration could be accommodated without any problems, even though the British government knew quite well that was not the case. And there's good documentation on the proposition that it knew quite well that it was not going to be able to resolve the conflict, namely that the continued migration was going to lead to an untenable situation, which Britain finally acknowledged publicly in 1937. But then, going forward to 1947 and 1948, you had the United Nations at that point entering into the issue and adopting a resolution to partition Palestine. Then you had the Nakba, and the United Nations more or less sat silent as the Nakba occurred. And it was not that they were not being told what was going on. If you read the transcripts of Security Council meetings for 1948, and I would advise anyone interested to do so, they're all available on the UN website, you'll see that the Arab Higher Committee was persistently pressing the point that the Arabs were being expelled from Palestine. In particular, Dr. Henri Catan, who was the lawyer, one of the lawyers representing the Arab Higher Committee, you'll find his name in those records. He made an especially strong point when there was an atrocity committed in the village of Dawaima in October of 1948, when the elements of what by then was called the Israel Defense Force went into the town, gathered men in a mosque, and killed a large number of them. And it was actually, I think, the Syrian delegate that brought that before the Security Council. And the response came from Abba Eban, who was representing Israel at that point. Unfortunately, the Syrian delegate had made a mistake in what he submitted and had misidentified the location of Dawaima. Had said it was north of Jerusalem rather than south of Jerusalem, which is where it is, near Al-Khalil. And Abba Eban said, here you find the Arabs lying again. They're saying that there was an atrocity in a village, and there's no such village north of Jerusalem by that name. And eventually that was cleared up. But the Security Council never dealt with that and never did more in the year 1948 than to call for a ceasefire. It never called the IDF or the predecessors of the IDF in the period before May, never called them on the expulsion that was going on. The General Assembly did deal with the matter in December of 1948 in Resolution 194, calling for the repatriation. So it did do that much, but it didn't say why that had occurred. But then if you move to 1956, you do find the United Nations doing a bit better with the invasion, the tripartite invasion of Egypt by France and Britain and Israel. That was dealt with first in the Security Council, where resolutions were proposed to condemn France and Britain and Israel, and they were vetoed by France and Britain as permanent members of the Security Council. But then the matter went to the General Assembly, where there was similar condemnation that did eventually lead to an Israeli withdrawal. But going ahead to 1967, it gets very bad again, because the Security Council didn't deal with the fact that Israel committed aggression in 1967, even though it was well known, in particular to the United States, that the action had been one of Israeli aggression, because the Israeli government had for several weeks prior to June 5th of 1967 been lobbying the US government for permission to invade Egypt. And so when the invasion did come, the United States was quite aware that it was undertaken by Israel without there being any expectation that Egypt was going to attack. The CIA was keeping fairly good tabs on the situation, and the US government kept telling Abba Eban that Egypt was not going to attack. But finally, as you know, the IDF did attack. And when that then came before the Security Council, the United Nations had extensive discussion of the matter, both in the Security Council and in the General Assembly. There were resolutions proposed by the Soviet delegate to condemn Israel for aggression, and those didn't go anywhere. And the United States, even though it well knew that Israel had committed aggression, kept silent. Ambassador Goldberg spoke with the Israeli representatives, and this is recorded in some of the memoirs, and asked them what he could do to help. And basically they said, just keep your mouth shut, and that's what Ambassador Goldberg did. So if you look at those records, and these records are very interesting, Security Council in June of 1967, and the General Assembly, which held a special session on the matter, also in June of 1967, you will not find a single representative saying that Israel acted lawfully in that war. You will not find a single one, including the United States. The United States, as I say, kept quiet on the matter and diverted the discussion to saying, well, we shouldn't really get into the question of who started the war. We should talk about an overall solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which led, unfortunately, to Resolution 242 in November of 1967, a resolution that did not call for Israeli withdrawal as a self-standing matter. I know those records are very interesting, because if you look at what it was again Abba Eban who represented Israel in both the General Assembly and the Security Council, and when the invasion took off and then was discussed in the Security Council, he claimed that the Egyptians had started the fighting. Which didn't make much sense because of the overwhelming Israeli force that was being brought to bear against Egypt. But in any event, he said that the Egyptians had shelled 3 villages in southern Israel. And this was the story that the Israeli government gave to the premier of the Soviet Union and to Lyndon Johnson in 2 letters that were written and sent on the morning of June 5th, 1967. And these letters, each one says that Egypt shelled 3 villages that morning, and that precipitated an Israeli counter-response. They wrote up these letters so fast, if you look at them, you'll find that it's not the same 3 villages that are named in the 2 letters. So there's one letter to Premier Kosygin in Russia that names 3 villages, another to Lyndon Johnson that names 3 villages. And they got for 2 of the villages, they have the same names, and for the 3rd, they're different villages. So this was a reflection of the fact that they had made this story up only within the previous 24 hours, because their original story that they were going to give for attacking Egypt was that Egypt had attacked first, namely an attack on an Israeli vessel going through the Straits of Tehran. They had a plan because Lyndon Johnson kept telling them, don't fire the first shot, don't fire the first shot. So they came up with a plan which they actually ran by the US government to see whether it would wash. And the plan was that they were going to send a vessel through the Straits of Tehran, expecting the Egyptian artillery to fire on it, and then they would say, aha, Egypt has fired, and now we have launch a full invasion. They actually had a vessel that that came from the Israeli transport agency, ZIM, that they called the Dolphin. And they had it already with about 60 Israeli military people pretending to be commercial sailors on this vessel in the east coast of Africa, in a port opposite the Straits of Tehran, waiting orders to sail into the Straits of Tehran. And this is, I'm now talking June 1 or June 2nd. The plan ultimately was squelched by Moshe Dayan, who was afraid that the Egyptians would be smart enough not to shoot, and then the plan wouldn't work. So that left Abba Eban having to come up with a fake explanation within about a 24-hour period. But in any event, that is really, and not just a historically significant episode, but it's continuing to be important. If you look at what Ehud Barak said during the Camp David 2000 as to why Israel wouldn't withdraw when he was pressed by the Palestinian side for withdrawal from Gaza and the West Bank, he said, well, we took it in self-defense. If you look at those records, Israel did not argue self-defense even. That was something that was invented after the fact, after it became obvious that the Egyptians had not, in fact, fired on the morning of June 5th. So it was a backup justification, you might say. But in any event, to move forward quickly, the matter got into a negotiation phase in the 1990s with the Oslo Agreement, and that ultimately led, well, finally in 1999 to actual negotiations, which, as you're aware, have not gone anywhere. But these were very difficult. I was asked to be a consultant in those negotiations to the Palestinian side, and this was organized actually by the British government to have a legal team that would advise the Palestinian side, because the Israelis had a big raft of lawyers in their foreign ministry, and the Palestinian side didn't. So I got involved in that and got into being responsible for the refugee question, which we can talk about later. But I do want to move forward because I want to indicate just briefly some of the things in international law that are going on now. One is that well, I'll tell you about it. The UN Conference on Trade and Development has decided to write up an extensive paper on the question of the economic costs of the Israeli occupation of Palestine territory, which it did last year, and as a way of setting the stage, ultimately, and this may never come to fruition, but setting the stage for compensation to be paid for the damage caused by the occupation. And apart from that, simply to make the point that the occupation has caused significant damage, not only by direct Israeli action, but also in preventing development. This paper has a section on the human right to development and argues that Israel has impeded the right to development. This is kind done from a legal dimension. I helped draft this paper for UNCTAD, and it refers to the various legal provisions that are being violated by Israel. This is the title of the document. You see it's from the UN Conference on Trade and Development. It was actually requested by the General Assembly. So the General Assembly asked UNCTAD to undertake this project, and it published this. You can Google economic costs of Israeli occupation and get that. But some of the other things that are going on. One is that the government of Palestine has sued the United States and the International Court of Justice over the relocation of the embassy to Jerusalem. That was just filed recently, and it's a case that's likely to go on for some time. The other is that there is activity in the International Criminal Court, which may be of more interest to non-governmental organizations, since non-governmental organizations really have access to the International Criminal Court, whereas they don't have access to the International Court of Justice. But the International Criminal Court is seized of what they call a preliminary examination with respect to Palestine, relating to the settlements in the West Bank and relating to the 2014 war. So that's going on there. As well, there's a current case involving the Gaza flotilla before the International Criminal Court, which has been in process now for a number of years, because the prosecutor has decided that while what was done by the Israeli Navy was a war crime, and she says that very clearly, that what they did on the Mavi Marmara, the killing of the persons on the Mavi Marmara, was a war crime committed in a state of belligerent occupation because of the belligerent occupation of Gaza, and that it involved an attack on civilians by a military force. But she said nonetheless she wasn't going to investigate it fully because it was not something that she found to have been planned by the Israeli government. The court itself has some oversight on the prosecutor, and they've been fighting back and forth now for about 2 years, with the court telling her, we think this is significant enough that you should be investigating it. And she says back to them, well, I'm looking at it again, and I don't think I should have to. There's going to be an oral argument about this in The Hague on Wednesday morning of this week. In fact, I think it's going to be live streamed. If you go on this website, International Criminal Court, that will be taking place on Wednesday morning. And the judges are really criticizing her because she took the episode on the vessel in isolation, apart from the context, apart from the blockade of Gaza, and apart from how it was that the Israeli Navy got onto the vessel in the first place. She accepted what you may have seen is called the Palmer report that was done, that said that it was not a violation of international law for Israel to board the Mavi Marmara 70 miles out to sea on the high seas. Rather absurd conclusion. And the Human Rights Council of the UN actually appointed an inquiry group which said that it was a violation of international law. So the judges are saying, when you look at the entire situation, it's much more serious than just what happened on the vessel itself. In any event, that's going to be argued on Wednesday morning. But I just wanted to mention those as some of the current matters that are being dealt with through international institutions. Actually, next week, the Security Council is going to have an informal session about the settlements called session being called by the ambassador of Indonesia, and I'm going to be presenting a short talk at the Security Council on that subject, along with several other persons that they've asked to come as experts to talk about the legality of Israel's settlements and the consequences of the settlements. But I will stop at that point, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, Professor Quigley. And now the floor is Dr. Mount Rabbani. You have 23 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just for the purpose of clarification, I don't have a doctorate. No. All right. So, first of all, I'd like to thank CİGA and Dr. Sami for organizing this conference. Whether in matters domestic or foreign, it's fashionable to characterize President Trump as the disruptor in chief. This has been no less true of current U.S. policy towards Palestine. Among the measures adopted by the Trump administration that were carefully avoided by its Republican and Democrat predecessors alike are the following. The Trump administration has effectively abandoned endorsement of Palestinian statehood, a position that became official U.S. policy during the administration of George W. Bush. The Trump administration has terminated the USAID program in the occupied Palestinian territories that commenced during the Clinton administration. None of this aid went to the Palestinian Authority or to its budget. Tellingly, the only form of direct U.S. assistance to the PA, consisting of various forms of open and covert support to the Palestinian security forces, remains untouched. The Trump administration has ordered the closure of the PLO mission to the United States and expelled its diplomats, effectively severing diplomatic relations with the Palestinians, and in so doing, reversing a policy first adopted during the final days of the Reagan administration. The Trump administration has recognized Israel's annexation of the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, an act rejected as null and void by the Reagan administration. The Trump administration has formally ended the characterization of the West Bank and Gaza Strip as occupied territories, reversing the formal position of every U.S. administration since Israel first conquered these territories in 1967 during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. The Trump administration has terminated U.S. funding to and called for the abolition of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. This despite the fact that the U.S. played a central role in establishing this agency and its mandate during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, and has for many years been its single largest funder. The target of this initiative is not so much UNRWA, but rather the Palestine refugee question itself. The Trump administration hopes to liquidate this issue by compelling the United Nations to redefine Palestine refugees so that they effectively cease to exist. The Trump administration has reversed 70 years of U.S. policy first adopted by the Truman administration and recognized Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. Washington has, for all intents and purposes, extended this to a recognition of exclusive Israeli sovereignty over both West and occupied East Jerusalem, and has additionally begun the process of relocating the U.S. Embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to the Holy City. The Trump administration has ordered the closure of the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, which was opened in 1844 during the administration of John Tyler. U.S. relations with the Palestinians, such as they are currently conducted from the premises of the U.S. Embassy to Israel, as a subsidiary of the U.S.-Israel relationship. For those of you unfamiliar with Tyler, he was the first vice president to assume the presidency on account of the death of his predecessor, and is therefore popularly known as his accidency. Because the U.S. laws of succession were at the time unclear, a cloud of illegitimacy hovered over his tenure. Another predecessor, John Quincy Adams, described Tyler as a man with talents not above mediocrity and the spirit incapable of expansion to the dimensions of the station on which he has been cast by the hand of Providence, end quote. Tyler was considered out of step with the Whig Party he represented, which expelled him from its ranks, and all but one of his cabinet members resigned during his tenure. Whether his failure to secure re-election is an additional resonance from the past, we shall soon find out. And additionally, the Trump administration has introduced a policy announced by its chief Bulgarian, former U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, of vetoing the nomination of any Palestinian to a senior position in the United Nations. Given that such officials are nominated by the UN bureaucracy in their individual capacities, rather than by or as representatives of the PLO or PA, this can only be characterized as an explicitly racist policy. Many of these policy changes additionally represent a clean break with the international consensus on the question of Palestine, and as in the case of the relocation of the US Embassy, also stand in explicit violation of UN Security Council resolutions that by definition could only have been passed with US consent. Excuse me. The appearance is clearly one of a willful, radical departure from traditional US policy, and in form, it certainly is. But upon closer examination, there is a case to be made that Trump is building upon a long-standing bipartisan consensus and merely taking it to its logical conclusion. To denounce Trump and his government for seeking to consign the Palestinian people and their struggle for self-determination to the trash bin of history is of course entirely appropriate, but the administration's actions over the past 2 years hardly constitutes a comprehensive reversal of US policy. While previous Republican and Democrat administrations have generally avoided the shock jock approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict currently in vogue in the White House, we are not in uncharted waters. Take, for example, the US recognition of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. Trump was hardly the first US presidential candidate to pledge that he would do what he eventually did. For decades, every significant Republican and Democrat candidate has made exactly the same pledge. More to the point, the basis for this initiative was established by the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995, which was adopted by a resounding vote of 93-5 in the Senate and 374-37 in the House of Representatives. The act allowed the president to sign a waiver every 6 months, postponing implementation on national security grounds, and all Trump did last year was decline to sign a further waiver. In other words, there was no new legislation involved. Similarly, the closure of the Palestinian mission in the United States is based on the 1987 Anti-Terrorism Act, which defines the PLO as a terrorist organization and a threat to the United States, its allies, and international law, and prohibits the PLO from establishing or maintaining an office within the jurisdiction of the United States. Introduced by Senator Charles Grassley, the act enjoyed no less than 48 co-sponsors from every conceivable side of the aisle, comprising nearly half the Senate. Here again, Trump merely refused to issue a 6-month monthly certification exempting the PLO from the provisions of the act that otherwise remained in full force. On the refugee question, Washington's political class has for decades had UNRWA in its sights. The volume of deliberate misinformation on this particular issue has been nothing short of overwhelming. UNRWA, for example, was established by the UN General Assembly in 1949 to provide relief for refugees uprooted as a result of the 1948 war. And it continues to exist for the simple reason that, 7 decades on, the Palestinians remain a dispossessed and stateless people. UNRWA is not the custodian of Palestinian refugee rights, and there is nothing unusual in either international law or international practice in defining the descendants of refugees as refugees in the absence of conflict resolution. In this context, the Trump administration's efforts to produce the so-called deal of the century build upon and extend, at least as much as they contradict, the positions established by his predecessors during the Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama administrations. The distance between Dennis Ross and Jared Kushner is hardly an unbridgeable chasm. There are also clear continuities on other sides of the equation, and these help explain the evolution of U.S. policy. Here it is useful to think of several interrelated dynamics that tend to mutually reinforce each other: Israeli, Palestinian, American, and regional international. With respect to the Israeli dynamics, there's been an important shift over the course of the past decade, one in which the divide in the Israeli political spectrum was between those who advocated an indefinite perpetuation of the status quo or creeping annexation as the best way to ensure Israel's interest in the occupied territories, versus those proposing some form of territorial compromise, primarily with Jordan, but more recently with the Palestinians. Today, the divide is between those advocating an indefinite perpetuation of the status quo versus those promoting formal annexation. This transition from creeping to leaping annexation has developed over time and is now immeasurably empowered by the Trump administration. Its open embrace of the most extreme elements of the Israeli political spectrum and adoption of their agenda as its own has served to push the Israeli center even further towards the right. The various U.S. measures I outlined earlier have transformed the prospects of annexing the West Bank from a reckless ambition to a realistic opportunity. Israel's growing army of annexationists, quite rightly, see the period between the recent Israeli parliamentary elections and the upcoming American presidential elections as a golden opportunity that may not be repeated during their lifetimes. With respect to Palestinian dynamics, this has been addressed by several other speakers, so I will limit myself to observing that the fragmentation and disintegration of the national movement and the leadership's continued fealty to Oslo have emboldened and empowered Israel and the United States in their dealings with the Palestinians and encouraged them to adopt increasingly extreme policies and demands. I have a section on regional polarization, but in the interest of time, I'll skip it over, but we'll be happy to discuss it during the discussion session. And I'll now turn to Oslo. It was in fact a quarter century ago, on account of the Oslo process, that the seeds of the most recent developments were planted. Often mistaken as a blueprint for a two-state settlement, Oslo was above all a formula whereby Israel was able to consolidate and perpetuate its occupation, as by design rather than as a result of the failure of the process. Oslo did so by subcontracting essential civil and security functions to the Palestinians and by insulating itself from meaningful international scrutiny through the mechanism of permanent negotiations, which, again as a matter of design, consistently failed to resolve or even address the core issues of the conflict. And it was above all thanks to American hegemony in regulating the Israeli-Palestinian relationship that the international consensus on the resolution of the conflict was replaced by Israeli power and impunity in exercising it. Seen from this perspective, the Oslo agreements should be seen not as a failure, but as an enormous success, not for peace or for Palestinian rights, but for continued Israeli control of the occupied territories. So successful that Palestinians, virtually without exception, today consider themselves significantly further removed from the fulfillment of their national aspirations than on the eve of the process. While the Trump administration has, as with most issues, opted for a disruptive approach toward the question of Palestine, there is an underlying logic to the belief that 25 years of Oslo have made Palestinians ripe for the ultimate fait accompli. Rather than wait for the Trump administration to present a diplomatic plan and invite the parties to negotiate terms, we would do well to recognize that the initiative already exists and is already being implemented unilaterally before our very eyes. Those waiting for Washington to unveil a coherent diplomatic initiative are, in my view, waiting in vain. If there was even the outline of a plan, it would, like everything else with this administration, have leaked by now. The current administration is inverting the traditional U.S. approach: implement first, then perhaps publish. In this respect, I would expect a revival of the quality of life agenda pursued by Israel during the 1980s, in which economic incentives substitute for political rights. This time it is likely to come with a generous serving of annexation. Many have observed that Netanyahu would not have raised the issue of annexation during the recent election campaign if he did not believe he had U.S. support for doing so. This trajectory would not necessarily lead to the termination of the two-state settlement paradigm, but rather an Israeli-American attempt to reconfigure it. A Palestinian entity based in the Gaza Strip, with isolated self-governing outposts in the West Bank, and the functional extension into the Arish region of the Sinai Peninsula, and, on the other hand, an Israeli state incorporating much, most, and perhaps eventually all of the West Bank. This would be broadly consistent with what has already been implemented of Plan Kushner, and would help explain Secretary of State Pompeo's recent refusal to express even the slightest concern at the prospect of annexation. Israel has many annexationist options. It is, at least initially, likely to focus on Area C, which, although comprising some 60% of the West Bank, would leave the great majority of West Bank Palestinians and Gaza Strip Palestinians under Palestinian rather than Israeli authority. If Israel indeed proceeds in this direction, it would be difficult, and I would argue politically untenable, for Palestinians or the international community to demand more extensive Israeli annexation and conferral of Israeli citizenship on West Bank Palestinians. There are, in any case, various formulas through which Israel can seek to incorporate maximum territory with minimal Arabs. Should this indeed come to pass, it would in many respects form the logical culmination of over half a century of Israeli occupation. Mix one measure of creeping annexation, add several helpings of Israeli impunity, and top it off with generous amounts of American indulgence and empty European posturing, and this is precisely what you get. I would similarly argue that Trump's policies on the question of Palestine also did not emerge from a vacuum, but rather build on various precedents adopted by Congress and previous U.S. administrations. We now have a situation in which, one, the U.S. president is already making support for Israel a cornerstone of his partisan warfare with the Democrats and his upcoming re-election campaign. Second, key members of Trump's national security team and a significant proportion of his base openly proclaim that Trump was installed in the White House by none other than God in order to serve Israel. Three, U.S. efforts to resolve the question of Palestine are led by an Inspector Clouseau who fancies himself Detective Poirot, if not the reincarnation of Metternich, and who, along with his two aides, have for decades been invested in Israel's settlement project. You may recall that during his first visit to the White House, Netanyahu fondly reminisced about sleeping in Jared Kushner's bed. Yet, what do we mean with sweeping statements that Israel's election results have put paid to the two-state paradigm? To at least this Palestinian ear, it sounds like a clarion call, however inadvertently, for permanent occupation and acquiescence in annexation. Rather, it is precisely at this critical historical juncture that we must hold fast to the international consensus and international law. Given the current desultory state of the Palestinian national movement, Palestinians possess little more than what the late Edward Said termed the power of refusal. This means, first and foremost, categorically refusing to lie in the same bed in which Netanyahu slept so comfortably, and refusing to engage in futile efforts to avoid blame for Plan Kushner's stillbirth. Absent Palestinian consent, it will be virtually impossible for even Israel and America's closest regional allies to formally engage with their designs. It is important to note that there is also a broader agenda at play, and one in which the question of Palestine is a means to achieve a larger end as much as it is an objective itself. Best exemplified by National Security Advisor John Bolton, this broader agenda consists of degrading the international system and its institutions, eliminating international law and international accountability from the rulebook, and making U.S. power the sole arbiter of international affairs. The reason the question of Palestine has been chosen by the Trump administration as a battering ram of choice to dismantle the international order is because support for Israel has in recent decades enjoyed levels of bipartisan support other U.S. allies can only dream of. Yet the negative response to Netanyahu's re-election by some prominent Democrats who have been traditionally silent when it comes to Palestinian rights is a potentially positive sign. These dangers may also present an opportunity. Palestinians are in a position to make their cause a litmus test for the survival and integrity of the international system, particularly if Israel proceeds with acts of annexation, and particularly if it does so with U.S. support. Thus far, the U.S. has conferred recognition on Israeli acts of annexation that are several decades old. In the case of the West Bank, Israel would have to act first and could face significant international consequences for doing so. That said, it is important to note that change does not self-generate and will require intensive and extensive effort. Thank you. The Palestinians will first have to put their house in order along the lines proposed by several speakers over the past several days here. Salvation is not going to come from the Arab world, Third World, or Europe. But if the Palestinians act first and act strategically, they can mobilize all of the above. If they act wisely and properly, they will have many willing and even some unwilling allies. I will conclude with a brief observation about the justice of the Palestinian cause. As many speakers here have noted, our cause is just. Yet the justice of a cause is a poor indicator of its outcome. If causes triumph simply because they are just, we would live in a very different world than that which we inhabit today. And just causes are in fact routinely defeated. Victory is a complex combination of factors, and we must work ceaselessly to at least turn those within our power to influence to our advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kabani. And now we are to give the floor to Dr. Norman Finkelstein. I don't know if it is ready or not. Hello, Mr. Finkelstein, how are you?
I'm fine. Do you hear me clearly?
Thank you so much. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes, no problem.
First of all, thank you for having me, and having listened very carefully to the first two presentations, I genuinely regret not having been there in person because I found the presentations both accurate and also bearing on topics that I have been exploring. I was quite surprised that Professor Quigley is familiar with the Mavi Marmara case in the International Criminal Court, because basically it's been a very well-kept secret. I myself am working on that case right now, and my desk is cluttered with literally thousands of pages bearing on the case. And I think it's an important one because I think it may culminate in Israel's, if not indictment, at least investigation by the International. It's too complex to look at right now, but it's an important development, and it's to Professor Quigley's credit that he apparently is familiar with the details. Mouin Rabbani's presentation was really excellent. I'd have to say it's a tour de force. It was first rate. It happens that a lot of what he said intersects or overlaps with what I will have to say now. And my point of departure is actually some remarks that Muin made a few months ago, and which he repeated well, it's morning for me, I guess it's afternoon for you. So let me begin. I always pay close attention to what Muin says because I think he is the best analyst of what's going on in the Middle East in general and of Israel-Palestine in particular. And a few months ago, Muin dismissed the idea of a Jared Kushner peace plan because he said, well, there haven't been any leaks. And if there haven't been any leaks, that's an indication that there's no plan. I happen to be of the opinion, but I don't think it's a big difference with Muin. I do think there is a plan now, because certain factors have, in the course of time, the past year, they have ripened, or unexpected factors have come into play, which means now is the right moment to launch a plan. Number one, and this is one factor that Muin, for reasons of time, apparently didn't have a chance to go into, there is the Saudi role. The defeat that the Saudis suffered in Syria and in Yemen, and then the unexpected disaster of the Khashoggi affair, have now made Saudi Arabia more intent on trying to sow an alliance with Israel and the United States. In the case of Israel, there was the electoral victory by Mr. Netanyahu, which means he now has a freer hand to sign an agreement. The Palestinian Authority is now facing a major financial crisis, and so will be more desperate to get money in exchange for some sort of agreement. Hamas, unfortunately, was not able to turn the Great March of Return into a political or diplomatic victory of any kind, basically because they received no international support, whether by states, whether by international or institutions, or in particular, they received, or the Great March of Return, received no support from the international solidarity movement, which wholly ignored the Great March of Return and instead focused obsessively, in my opinion, on BDS. And the US now does need to show something for the claim that's been ballyhooed the past 4 years of the deal of the century before Americans go to the polls in 2020. So it seems as if all the main players, the Saudis, Israel, the PA Hamas, and the US, they all have a stake in some sort of plan. What will the plan look like? I'll just fill in some of the details, but I think Muin has already outlined it. It will be an updated version of Ariel Sharon's Gaza disengagement, which means it'll be Gaza for the West Bank. Gaza will experience a partial lifting of the blockade and an economic rehabilitation financed by the Saudis. The quid pro quo will be Israel's annexation of the major settlement blocks, about 9.5% of the West Bank, on what's called the Israeli side of the wall. It will also be offered and economic rehabilitation to be financed by the Saudis again. Israel will maintain the security border along the Jordan River, and the West Bankers will be granted some kind of self-rule with future political options left open. In addition, they will get, that will be the carrot, economic rehabilitation, or in some, it will be a version of what's called, Benjamin Netanyahu has called it, the economic peace in the West Bank. That is some form of quote-unquote economic prosperity in exchange for any political gains by the Palestinians. Now the question is, are there sufficient political forces that can realize that plan? It appears that Moeen is skeptical that such political forces exist, and here I would respectfully dissent, though it's a matter of speculation, I acknowledge. What's Israel's gain? Israel, first of all, is currently under the leadership of Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is first and foremost a politician. He doesn't really have a strategic vision. He tries to exploit the political moment. And there are many instances I can cite of his trying to exploit a political moment. And sometimes even he does not exploit a political moment if he calculates there is advantage in ignoring it. So, for example, about a week before the election in Israel, there was an accidental or an unintended Hamas rocket attack on Israel, and everybody wondered whether this would be the prelude to a new invasion. And the mistake I thought at the time was, people think that Israel actually reacts to quote-unquote security threats. It does not. Israel reacts on the basis of political calculation. And Netanyahu recognized that if you launch an invasion, the outcome was very unpredictable. And therefore, given that the election would be close between him and Mr. Gantz, he decided not to launch the attack, not to take the political advantage of it, because it might jeopardize his electoral victory. So Mr. Netanyahu is a politician, somebody who's always calculating political advantage. And as Moeen, in my opinion, correctly pointed out, he realizes that the Trump administration in general, and in particular between now and 2020, it's a godsend. The Trump administration has basically, under the leadership or at the behest of the Israeli government, tried to resolve all of what are called the final status issues of the Israel-Palestine conflict unilaterally. So, as Moeen pointed out, they've attempted to defund UNRWA to resolve the refugee question. They've acknowledged the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem, the Golan, effectively ending the Jerusalem question. And if the U.S. lends its approval to the annexation of the settlement blocks, then the last two of what are called the final status issues, namely borders and settlements, would be resolved. So it's a huge opportunity, or at least it's conceived a huge opportunity, to try to do an end run around the international consensus by the Trump administration unilaterally resolving the four final status issues, namely the refugees, Jerusalem, the borders, and the settlements. The other very big appeal for Netanyahu of such a Kushner plan would be, and here we didn't go into the point, but I suspect he would have if time allowed, it will allow for an unprecedented open alliance with the Saudis, handing Israel its biggest diplomatic victory since the Egyptian defection at Camp David in 1978. So, given Netanyahu's disposition as a politician above all, the possibility of unilaterally resolving in Israel's favor all the final status issues, and the huge political, military, diplomatic victory of an open alliance between Israel and the Saudis, there is, I think, unlike with the Kerry plan several years ago, there is now a huge incentive for Netanyahu, who effectively was the person that blocked the Kerry plan. There is now a huge incentive for him to embrace the Kushner plan. The other big player is Saudis. They would get an alliance, which they have coveted, with Israel to fight the Shia axis led by Iran. It would also allow the rehabilitation of MBS after the Khashoggi affair. And if they pump in a lot of money to the West Bank, and in particular Gaza, they will get credit among the Palestinians for having financed their rehabilitation. What's the Trump administration's gain from such a plan? First of all, it will enable Trump to peel off some mega-Jewish donors and Jewish votes from the Democratic and into the Republican fold. And that will be a significant victory for Trump, especially in 2020 if Bernie Sanders gets the Democratic nomination, the possibility of winning over a significant part of the Jewish vote and large Jewish donors, if the plan is pushed through, I think it's a real prospect. As for Jared Kushner himself, speaking realistically, his only concern is the prospect of major business deals in Saudi and the Gulf. Should he pull off this plan, I very much doubt he gives a darn about the fate of Israel. Just as Trump is fundamentally a politician, Jared Kushner is fundamentally a businessman. And he realizes that if he can pull this off, he'll have the Saudis in his back pocket, and that means a lot of dollars in his two front pockets. Hamas, in my opinion, will formally denounce the Kushner plan, but quietly it will go along. First of all and foremost, there's the economic catastrophe in Gaza. Secondly, there's the feeling by Hamas that it was abandoned not just by the international community, but it was abandoned by the West Bank Palestinians, and therefore it owes nothing to anybody and owes only to itself. And thirdly, there was the failure of the Great March to break the Israeli siege. So for those three reasons, the economic catastrophe, the abandonment by the whole of the international community, the international solidarity movement, and the West Bank Palestinians, and the prospect that they will get nothing from the year and more of heroic sacrifice by the people of Gaza, it's quite likely that if there is a possibility of partially lifting the siege and massive Saudi monies, they will tacitly, not explicitly, but tacitly go along with the Kushner plan. That leaves the Palestinian Authority, which of course will formally denounce the Kushner plan as a betrayal of the two-state settlement. But as everybody in the room knows, historically it always makes noises, but still maintains what's called security cooperation. And as always, it will claim that the people don't want the Palestinian Authority to dissolve, because if it dissolves, the West Bank will descend into anarchy. So they will use the alleged concerns of the Palestinian people to maintain power. And what's most important, they too will get Saudi money with which they can fill their front pockets, back pockets, and Swiss bank accounts. And there will be relatively little resistance.
I'm sorry for interrupting. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have 5 minutes left. I'm sorry for
Yes.
remark.
Yeah, I'm done. I just will leave just the, okay. Would you like me to stop now?
No, you have 5 minutes more.
Okay, that's perfect. I only need 5 more minutes.
Okay.
The question then is, what will be the international reactions and what are the prospects? Europe will not recognize the legitimacy of the Jared plan, especially as formally the annexation will be implemented unilaterally by Netanyahu, the annexation of the major settlement blocks. But that won't make much difference because Europe has never done much more than talk on this issue. For reasons which are already outlined by Moeen, the U.S. will broadly support the Jared plan across the political spectrum. First of all, because the annexation of the major settlement blocks will exclude the bulk of the Palestinian population, and therefore there will not be formally the danger of apartheid. The large number of Palestinians will be outside the annexation. The U.S. elites across the political spectrum, whether it be Dennis Ross, Martin Indyk in the Democratic Party side, in my guess probably also including Robert Malley, will support the Israeli annexation of the settlement blocks, because that's always been, or I should say for the past 15 years, has been U.S. elite policy. The claim is, as it's often said, in any final agreement, Israel will annex the major settlement blocks. That's a given in all discussions in elite circles. And it will be said that, of course, in the future, during negotiations, there are possibilities for a land swap. And U.S. elites across the board will support an Israeli-Saudi alliance against what's considered the major enemy of the U.S. in the region, namely Iran. So the international reactions will be overwhelmingly either irrelevant, as in Europe, or supportive, as in the United States, across the political spectrum. What are the prospects of all this? Here, I guess I slightly disagree with Moeen, but I'm not even sure there's even a slight disagreement. As Moeen excellently pointed out, the Trump administration is an aberrant political phenomenon. And And so in my opinion, its endorsement of various Israeli annexations will probably not carry over once Trump leaves office, because it is such an aberration and it doesn't have any congressional or formal congressional support. I think that a lot of what Trump has done will come and go with his administration. I don't think it will have an enduring impact, though, as Moeen pointed out, all he's done is formalize what has been what's called bipartisan policy for the last 20 or so years. But the formalization, I think, will just come and go with Trump. There will be, and we can't trivialize it, there will be a significant improvement in the quality of life of the people of Gaza. If there's even a partial lifting of the blockade and a huge inflow of money from Saudi for the people of Gaza, that will be a significant improvement. And we can't ignore, I think, that fact. In the case of the West Bank, it will just be a continuation of the status quo. In many ways, the key to this plan, namely the Saudis, it will actually, because I think it's mistaken, I'll just say it in passing, I think it's mistaken to see Israel as being the major impetus behind the Kushner plan. The major impetus is not Israel. Israel stands to gain some things, but the big victor will be the Saudis, who will have that open alliance with Israel, which after the disasters in Yemen, Syria, and then the Khashoggi affair, will amount to a huge victory for the Saudis. It will be probably the near full rehabilitation of Saudi in the U.S. Media and among U.S. elites. And that will probably be the biggest change that will occur. So I say the likelihood is there is a plan. It will probably be implemented unilaterally and piecemeal. However, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority will go along with it informally as they denounce it formally. I think its long-lasting prospects are probably pretty minimal. They won't change anything significant except for the open alliance between Israel and Saudi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we have, I think, more than 20 minutes to discuss. So we have so many questions, many remarks, many important points, also many different issues. The international law itself, the United Nations, the Security Council, Gaza, West Bank, etc., etc. Please, just describe to whom you direct your question. We will take all questions together and then answer them all together. Okay? Okay, let's start with you, please.
Hi, my name is Jose Mori. I'm from the UK and I am a BDS activist in the UK. I'd like to begin by thanking all the speakers for the brilliant presentations and the great detail you went into. I would like to direct my thoughts towards Norman Finkelstein because I couldn't help but think about your comment on how we focus obsessively on BDS rather than the Great Return March. When actually, as a matter of fact, as a BDS national organiser in the UK, we have Palestinian students in the UK who have been campaigning for their universities to end their investments in Israel's arms trade, to end their research with Israel's arms trade. And during the Great Return March, Leeds University became the first university in England to divest from 3 companies arming Israel. And those students were driven by their passion for justice for the Palestinian people, both in Gaza and the Palestinians on the front line who are being snapped down by Israel's military, which our universities, our institutions, and our banks are financing. And during the Great Return March, it was HSBC who divested, because of BDS, from Elbit Systems, Israel's largest private arms company, due to BDS campaigns. And in the international community, one of the best things we can do to show solidarity is by ensuring that our institutions are held to account and are not complicit in supplying Israel's military. So I don't really want to. I don't really have a question.
Can we come to the question?
It's just a comment that I found that a little out of place and it's not necessarily true.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, please.
Good evening. Good morning. Hello. I like the presentation that was given by John Kogli on the introduction on the history of the Palestinian struggle, and Abba Iban, who was described by the words of Professor Norman Finkelstein as the most exquisite liar. And that's true, because he was very openly lying about what happened in this time of the war. My name is Yunus, I'm from Morocco. I study robotics engineering. We have had 3 days of a wonderful conference with the lineup of brilliant people who are expert on this question. But the people we elect in the office and those who take the decisions really are people who will never understand what we're talking about here. Because politicians in general are people who are biased, who can be bought by the corporates. And I don't think that we are making much difference, because as we are speaking, probably there is an international conference on Israel that is running probably somewhere in Brooklyn, I imagine, and it's inviting bankers and people who are funding Israel. So I think that is a problem we have, is politicians are not adequately, or not conveniently addressing the question of Palestinian issue. We have spoken about Trump, and Trump has chosen his envoy in Middle East, a kid, Jared Kushner, whose only knowledge about Iraq, for example, he got it when he was waiting for an airlift. So I think we should address the elephant in the room. And what is the problem is democracy, because democracy makes it possible that people like Trump are getting into office. And I imagine he will be in office for another 4 years, because now that Joe Biden has jumped in, I don't think we will have much choice. We will have just Trump and Joe Biden, who are both Zionists. And Joe Biden is a self-declared Zionist. So I'm asking this question also to Professor Norman Finkelstein, because he wrote as one of his favorite books, Plato Republic. And in Plato Republic, Socrates is very skeptical about the whole business of democracy. And so Socrates lived in the 3rd century BC. I think he was a visionary more than we are, because should the question be actually, should we trust anymore any form of democracy? Is it a suitable way to go? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Dr. Finkelstein, do you hear the floor?
I hear every word. I'm listening intently.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Thank you so much. It's Ali Abdulaziz. I'm a PhD candidate at Ankara University. Actually, it's heartbreaking when Norman said that Palestinians couldn't transform the sacrifices into political achievement. Actually, it's a problem that Palestinians unfortunately used to. I'm a Gazan, and I lost many of my relatives and friends in the latest war and in the Great Return March. People there are extremely ready to sacrifice, extremely ready to struggle, to take part in struggling, even popular struggle or armed struggle, any kind of struggle, with a view to liberating their lands. But there is a problem. There is a genuine problem that Palestinian leadership have yet to transform the sacrifices of their own people to political achievements. I'm directing this question to Dr. Moin Rabani. Is it a leadership crisis? Is it the absence of the Arab chill supporting Palestinians? Is it the problem of the international community? My point of view, I do remember one of the Palestinian leaders, he said that when negotiating in Cairo in 2014, We thought that we came to Cairo to negotiate Israelis, but we found ourselves negotiating Egyptians and Israelis at the same time. The Arab dictators, the Arab regimes will not allow for a Palestinian political achievement, because they know very well that if the Palestinians do any achievement, if the popular struggle works in Palestine, it means that popular struggle works within their own countries. That's why the Arab dictators themselves fear of any political achievement for Palestinians. The Arab dictators will not allow for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to break the siege by popular protests in the Great Return March. I'm asking Dr. Main for that, and thank you for Dr. Sam Larian and CİGA for this wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, please.
I mean, this was by far the most interesting panel for me. I wanted to elaborate about what Professor Quigley talked about international law, and also shed the light upon some facts which is unknown. I was the first person who worked in '97 on the archives of the International Red Cross. And to my amazement, there was only one massacre reported by the Red Cross, and in April 1948. And the Red Cross delegation actually arrived on Palestine on the 4th of April, and Deir Yassin was on the 9th, and we know about this famous report about the reporter, the delegate of the Red Cross. But also the international observers were there since June, and except Dawaime and other few, let's say, massacres, but also the observers of the United Nations were also, there was a complicity with the Israelis. But also I want to mention that they discovered on the headquarters of the international observers in June 1948 that the headquarters is bugged, and wired by the Israelis. And the United Nations didn't mention or publish about it. But what I think is very important, what Professor Finkelstein analysis. I agree with most of his analysis, and which is also, overlap with Mu'in's one. But I don't agree at all with the question of Saudi. The Saudis, since let's say 30 years, are taking totally bad strategies. First of all, they, participated in toppling Saddam Hussein, and they got Iran in Iraq. And second, and there is Syria, and there is Yemen. And I think I don't know why you think that the Saudis will gain through this new alliance with Israel. I think this will be their graveyard, really, the relation. And let's have a look about Egypt. This was the idea when Sadat concluded Camp David. All the press in Egypt, we will take the gold from the streets, blah, blah, blah. 40 years after Camp David, Egypt is zero. It's lost totally its regional power. It's nothing, it's poverty. They didn't, by development, by leaving Palestine, okay? They are more poorer than before. They are weaker than before. And the Saudis, believe me, this will be their graveyard.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, let's take a question from this side, please.
I can
Yeah,
talk
I'll
to the other side.
come to that side, please.
Thank you. I have a question to Professor John Quigley, but before I ask, I need to speak a bit. Thank you for pointing out the issue of settler colonialism. There was a problem in the Palestinian discourse that we shifted from the PLO discourse in 1969 from the settler colonial discourse, and we fell in the trap of the two-state discourse, the partition discourse. This trap was very dangerous that Mr. Moin mentioned that Palestinians have lost after Oslo, but not only practically, but also on the virtual level, in the terms of like on the value level. Now we're talking about borders, about land swap. We're talking about the Untitled, about the triangle with Al Jalil. We're talking about the Lieberman swap deal. We're talking about border issues, and now in the best case scenarios, apartheid issues. Instead of speaking of the talking about the original reason of the issue, the settler colonialism aspect of the struggle. The question is. To my knowledge, I have come across nothing from within the United Nations regime to acknowledge a Nakba or to acknowledge the Palestinian narrative, to acknowledge the root causes of the issue. Obviously, for the international support that Israel has had, has there been any documents, legal documents from within the United Nations or perhaps the League of Nations before that acknowledge any aspects of the Palestinian narrative that this was not a humanitarian migration from Europe into Palestine, but there was a political project to eliminate the native population and establish or plan a new entity on Palestine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, please.
Thank you for very thought-provoking presentations. I wanted to actually ask very quick questions to first Professor John Quigley. I'm really intrigued by the uncovering of various things that you're sharing with us. But I wanted to ask, does it have to be either or? Either we talk about international law as a tool of organizing or we don't. And I think it's the same, probably my question also will be to you. The same way is that, does it really have to be either BDS or supporting the Great March of Return? Do we really have to fall into dichotomous ways of applying? And the reason I'm raising this is that in the studies as well as the practice of people, colonized people's movements and organizing and so on, people do not really get multiple choice to say this is what we choose, this is not what we choose. Because the battles, the terms, everything is imposed upon colonized, marginalized people. So what weapons they use and what tactics they use, we can think about them as a toolkit of organizing. That people use whatever works in order for them to be able to advance their struggle. And again, some of the stuff exists before them. So there are some things about international law that has been, as people spoke about it, in a colonial context. However, it exists. So people can use that to mobilize them. People can use BDS, people can do the great. So I don't really see it either or. And I also don't agree with you, Norman, that actually people only focus on BDS and do not talk about the Great March of Return. There has been multiple international activities and Palestinian activities that have supported the Great March of Return. My other question is the question that you also mentioned, Norman, about the said that Hamas was abandoned by West Bank Palestinians. I actually don't see it that way, because I don't see it's either Hamas as one entity, not everybody in Gaza, all the groups in Gaza that come together and actually fight with each other and try to defeat Israeli aggression. And also there are, West Bank is not only represented by the Palestinian Authority. Actually, a lot of people in the West Bank do not approve and do not support the Palestinian Authority. So I kind of I see it, so two dichotomous entities, and maybe this is not the way you meant it, but maybe you can clarify on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, please. Yeah, can you repeat?
I am Claire Dadara. I'm one of the speakers in this conference. My first question is to Professor John Quigley. I am teaching international myself as well. And one of the important issues is about Balfour Declaration. How should we treat on the international law? I mean, based on Balfour Declaration, obviously, hundreds of thousands of Jews were allowed to live in Palestine. They migrated to Palestine in spite of the resistance of the people. They were against it, the Palestinians. So how should we treat on the international law? I mean, because the Zionists, they always refer on this fact that the British allowed them. So what's wrong with them? Why should you treat it as being illegal? So I would ask you, how can we treat this process of migration on the international? Second question to Mr. Finkelstein, Norman Finkelstein. In your opinion, Mr. Finkelstein, how should the international society treat Israel? In particular, the Arab world as well as the Muslim world. How should they treat Israel in order to liberate Palestine and, of course, to end Israeli aggression against its enemy, its neighboring states, and to end its occupation of Golan, for instance? How should they treat Israel? Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I ask you to repeat, who treat Israel?
Can you repeat please?
Yeah, okay. I mean, the way in which Israel is treated today, the narrative about two-state solution, reference to international law, the Palestinian struggle, I mean, they seem to be really, they lack in terms of a final solution. So I would ask your personal opinion about the way in which international society should treat. Can you hear me? How should international society treat Israel, in particular, international society in general, and particularly the Arab and the Muslim world? How should they treat Israel? What is, in your opinion, the solution to liberate Palestine and to end Israeli expansionism and aggression?
Thank you. Mr. Finkelstein, did you get the question? Mr. Finkelstein, did you get the question?
I'm going in and out. I've lost your sound now.
Did you get the question from the floor, the last question?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes, I did.
Okay. So can we move to the side, please?
Thank you very much. I have a question for Professor John Quigley. And I have a colleague, an international lawyer. His name is Curtis Dobler. I don't know if you know Curtis Dobler. And he wrote an article during the Palestinian Authority bid for statehood in 194, to become state 194 in the United Nations. And he said that it might jeopardize the concept of self-determination based on the territorial limit of British Mandate Palestine, because the statehood would be on the 67 border. The territorial limit of self-determination will be only limited to the West Bank and Gaza, and this will jeopardize the whole concept of the geographic limit of the self-determination, which should be applied to all of Palestine at the time of the post-First World War occupation of the British. So that's my question. And I would like to ask you, how would that reflect also on any, like the issue of two-state solution or the territorial, fantasia of the deal of the century and so on and so forth? Because all of them have ramification on the territorial content of the self-determination. I would like your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, we have limited time. So I'd be very happy if you keep your question very short in order to take all questions. So can you give the one behind you?
علي أبو وردة أعمل محامي في غزة. سؤالي لمنكلشتاين بالنسبة حكيت إنه ححكي باللغة العربية. أنت ذكرت إنه أي تاجر ممكن يشتغل بالسياسة ورجل أعمال يشتغل بالسياسة وهذا حقه.
Just a minute, please. Okay, go on, please.
هل نحن أمام عملية السلام بين الإسرائيليين والفلسطينيين منذ عقود الأرض مقابل السلام؟ هل يوجد مصطلح جديد السلام مقابل المال في صفقة القرن وفي السياسة العالمية الآن. شكرا.
So Norm, the question is whether the Land for Peace formula is being replaced by a new formula, which is peace for money.
What was the first formula?
Land for Peace, the traditional formula. And the question is, based on everything you've said, is that now being replaced by a new formula, which is peace for money?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Junaid, I'm at the University of Leeds. Thanks to all the presenters for wonderful presentations. Just a very quick one. I think that what Professor Finkelstein and one of the members in the audience said about the question with the disagreement on the role of Saudi Arabia, what's going to happen, I think actually both can be correct and at the same time, that in fact, from the US-Israeli angle, the Saudis will perceive themselves to be gaining the legitimacy and the support that they require in a position of tremendous weakness that they are now facing in the Islamic world. The Islamic world, their legitimacy is at its lowest point right now, and that continues to increase. And so I think that he's also right that in fact that open alliance will in fact be the death knell that the House of Saud deserves. So I think both of you are actually correct.
Okay, just two questions. One from here and one from here.
Thank you all for your talks. I just really wanted to ask Maureen if he could actually speak about the regional dynamics that you didn't get to in your presentation. I'm very curious to hear about that from your perspective. And my second question is for Professor John Quigley. We've been talking a lot in this conference about how the settler colonial analysis is being more used as a framework today. And as the gentleman stated, how the Palestinian discourse relied on the settler colonial analysis. I'm wondering why, on a legal level, in terms of legal advocacy, there hasn't been, or maybe we're not aware of more efforts to try to use the UN Genocide Convention, because for me that's what most applies to the settler colonial, like political or academic analysis, more so than some of the other legal methods that we've been approaching. And I know that there's limitations to the Genocide Convention. It hasn't been used much, but I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those limitations might be from your experience or perspective, and if there has been any serious conversation about using that as a legal way for advocacy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so last two questions. Okay.
My question to Dr. Quigley. UN Resolution 194, Article 11, which addresses the right of return for refugees for compensation. My question to you about this one is, compensation is conditional upon two factors, I think, upon practicable time and those who are willing to live at peace. So how important are these two conditions, and why were they put in there in Article 11? My other point is, I ran across one of the documents related to 194, and that addresses the right of Arab Jews to return to their homes, and the word compensation was not used, but the word reparation was used. Could you distinguish between the legal terms reparation and compensation, please? And for Dr. Finkelstein, could you please address or tell us something about your opinion of the of the applicability of 194 at this time and the right of return? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the last question, please.
Professor Maureen Rabbani, you kind of touched on this a bit, but is it naive to direct so much credit to any one president? Because there seems to be a pro-Israeli power structure around any president in the United States, and let's be honest, the situation would not have been much better for the Palestinians if Hillary Clinton had won the election. But that being said, do you have any hopes for the upcoming election that's coming up next year? And for Professor Quigley, what do you expect to happen to come out of the meeting that you're attending next week on the settlements? whether you sent to the Security Council, the meeting that it'll be in.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we have so many questions, Professor, quickly. I don't know if 4 minutes is enough to reply all the questions. Please, just try to keep in 4 minutes.
Could I have 4 hours? There was a question about whether the UN has really dealt with anything in terms of the atrocities in that Nakba, and I think it was avoided. I think the UN was very weak in 1948. It didn't want to hear what Henri Quétin was telling them because it didn't really have the capacity to do anything. It wasn't going to send troops in, which is what it should have done. If you read the Charter of the United Nations, Article 39 says the Security Council is supposed to deal with threats to the peace. I mean, certainly there was a threat to the peace in the Palestine situation. And the Security Council is enjoined in the UN Charter to employ sanctions leading up to military action, the way it was done in Kuwait in 1990. But it wasn't done with respect to Palestine. As to whether there is any suggestion in the UN documents as criticism of the overall Zionist plan, I think you don't find that either, and it's largely because of the League of Nations dealing with the Balfour Declaration, incorporating it in the Palestine Mandate, so that all seemed to have some imprimatur from the international community. So it's a problem. The thing just keeps getting worse, and that's in part why why I was critical in 1993 of the Oslo Agreement, because it meant that there was going to be a negotiation without settlements being stopped as a condition. And I had been involved in 1992 with the post-Madrid discussions that took place in Washington, that some of you may remember, that were overseen by Dr. Walid Khalidi and Dr. Haidar Abdel-Shefi. I mean, I consulted with them on a plan for what they were going to argue there. And then the PLO decided, and they were very insistent that they wouldn't talk about any substantive issues until there was a freeze on settlements, because they could see what was coming. And then the PLO went against that. I mean, while I was critical of the PLO for doing that, at the same time, they've been pushed because of all of these prior delicts, I would say, on the part of the United Nations, starting with the Palestine Mandate, then the failure to deal with the Nakba, the more or less endorsement of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. I mean, the PLO was pushed to the point that it really didn't have good alternatives when it entered into the Oslo Agreement. Whether the territorial issue with regard to statehood, to my mind, Palestine became a state in 1923 under the Treaty of Lausanne, the peace treaty. If you look at that treaty, it clearly designates Iraq, Syria, and Palestine as being states, and there are a number of provisions that you can point to and that I cite in my book called The Statehood of Palestine. And it seems to me that territory exists except to the extent that you can say that there has been international acceptance of deletions, you might say, deletions from the mandate territory. And when the United Nations admitted Israel as a member in 1949, it didn't deal with that question. It didn't deal with the question of Israel's borders. So to my mind, that's still all very flexible the problem, and I think this is where Professor Dobler is going, is that the PLO in 1988, when it declared itself as the government of Palestine, made a declaration that seemed to be oriented towards the West Bank and Gaza as the territory in which they would do it. So the international community has taken that as now the maximum position on the Palestinian side. But whether international law is a tool or not, I mean, I think it's something, it's not going to provide all the answers, but it's something that is usable in conjunction with other things. International law is the language in which one frames criticisms of countries. The Genocide Convention being one, and other treaties. Whether those treaties can be used, in principle, the Genocide Convention can be used against Israel. Israel is the party to the Genocide Convention. There are a couple of, well, there are many other states that are parties, and under the Genocide Convention, any other state can sue in the International Court of Justice. And there have been discussions about that in the past as a possibility. It's never gotten solidified, it's never been done, but the Nakba certainly could be brought within a suit under the Genocide Convention. The Resolution 194 and living at peace, I think that the phrase live at peace was really not so much a limitation as a description of the fact that people who had been expelled, wanted to come back. This was, at a very close point in time to their displacement. There was no, at that point, there were no fedayeen. It was, I think, kind of accepted as fact that the people who had left would come back and would live at peace. So I don't see that as so much of a serious limitation. The reparations provision in Resolution 194, that is not something that could be done by Israel as an alternative to repatriation. It's in addition to repatriation. So Resolution 194 says that there should be repatriation and that there should be reparation, so that someone who was expelled, their property was destroyed, A, they have a right to come back, and B, when they come back, they have a right to
no reparation, just compensation. The word was compensation, not reparation.
You're right. There was the word compensation, but that would mean monetary compensation for their loss. Yeah, there was a young man yesterday that made a comment about repatriation. I think his comment was, well, that's a long-term thing. We should maybe deal with Jerusalem first, and then talk about repatriation. That comment struck me because Resolution 194 clearly says that repatriation should happen as soon as there's peace, as soon as the fighting stops, because this was December 1948, and that it was something that was completely separate from other issues. It was a humanitarian issue. It was an absolute obligation on Israel that applied to Palestinians individually. It was not something that was supposed to be negotiated along with, settlements and a variety of other things. And it was Mr. Ben-Gurion who at the time tried to tie repatriation into other issues. His response to the Palestine Conciliation Commission, when Mark Etheridge and other members of the Palestine Conciliation Commission pressed him on repatriation, was to say, well, let's wait until we have overall peace with the Arab countries, then we can talk about repatriation. And that's not not consonant with Resolution 194. Of course, once Israel made peace with Egypt and with Jordan, was making peace with the Arab states, then they had to come up with another reason why they wouldn't repatriate, and that's so Mr. Netanyahu came up with the ethnic issue that it would dilute the Jewish population. But Mr. Ben Gurion was prevaricating from the get-go.
Thank you so much. Mr. Rabbani.
Thank you. Let me first begin by fully reciprocating.
4 minutes, don't forget it.
By fully reciprocating Norman Finkelstein's kind words about me, and I've indeed probably learned more from his political insights and observations than very, very many others, perhaps more than anyone else. So there was a question about whether the political achievements reflect the sacrifices that have been made. There was somewhere, yeah, I think I wouldn't go so far as to say there haven't been political achievements. Clearly there have. And the most important one, I mean, you need to look not just at the last year or decade, but look at what's happened since 1948. And I think it's important to point out that basically until the early to mid 1970s, the Palestinian question was seen as a refugee question in search of a humanitarian solution. And it then began to be seen by international consensus as a political question concerning a people with inalienable political rights, foremost among them self-determination. That, I think, is an extremely substantial achievement. Now, are the achievements commensurate with the sacrifices that have been made? No, they're completely out of whack. I believe that under different circumstances, the Palestinians could have achieved significantly more for significantly less sacrifices, but that's a different discussion. Now, I would like to address, and this is perhaps also getting into your question, the differences between Norman and myself on the Saudi question. Well, Norman is correctly pointing to the priority that the Saudis are putting on their relationship with the United States and drawing the conclusion that going along with the Kushner plan would be the best manner in which the Saudis can restore their place at the table of honor in Washington, D.C., and I think that's a coherent argument and has much in favor of it. I reached a different conclusion because I'm looking at it from a slightly different angle, which is that, as I think Andy and Musni was saying yesterday, both Sisi of Egypt and Salman of Saudi Arabia have appealed to Abu Mazen not to reject the American plan. You don't need to accept it, they said, but please don't reject it because they feel that would give them wiggle room to kind of tacitly deal with it. But if Palestinians do formally reject it, and then I think that would make it impossible for the Saudis or any other Arab government to accept it, because there's also the whole question of their internal situation. It's true that Sisi and Mohammed bin Salman's position today is unassailable domestically, but we're talking about very substantial societies, and I question whether the current king, Salman, would allow the crown prince to go along with a peace plan that A, completely capitulates on Jerusalem, which is more than just the Palestinian question, and B, is explicitly and openly rejected by the Palestinian leadership, especially, given these reports that a group of senior princes some months ago went to King Salman and said, do you really want to go down in history as the king who sold Aramco and sold out Jerusalem. So, these are serious issues. And as for Abu Mazen, I think he is probably already trying to find ways to avoid an even more complete rupture with the Americans. But again, one has to also look at it from the domestic angle. And I find it very, very difficult to see how Abu Mazen can fudge a position on an American peace plan, if one is ever published, that completely renounces Palestinian rights on Jerusalem, on the refugee question, on the settlement blocks, and all the rest of it. I simply don't see how that Palestinian leadership can. 1 minute?
We are actually we finished.
Okay. Well, just two very, very brief points then. On the financing of this deal, I forgot to point to the question of Mediterranean gas, and I think one issue that will come up will be that, in addition to the Gulf funding, which I think will be difficult to mobilize under those circumstances, Hamas will probably be offered access to the coastal gas reserves, and that could prove to be a significant source of not only energy but also income. And I do agree with Norm that Hamas has reached the conclusion that it owes nobody anything because it's effectively been abandoned by everyone. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Finkelstein, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, so the last floor is yours. You have 4 minutes. I will be happy if you keep your answers with 4 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll try to deal briefly with 3 points. Number 1, I consider it ironic and actually quite sad that whereas for the last several years, if you looked at the social media, the constant question among Palestinians and their supporters was, is there a third intifada? When will there be the third intifada? Where is the third intifada? And then lo and behold, on March 30th of last year, a third intifada did begin. It began in Gaza. It was a mass nonviolent resistance. It was extremely heroic, courageous, inspiring. And it required international support for it to succeed. And whereas everybody was anxiously awaiting the third intifada, when it finally burst on the scene, it was and continues to be almost completely ignored. I followed these developments quite closely. There have been perhaps at most a handful of demonstrations in the United States of solidarity with the people in Gaza. And there have been at most a handful of demonstrations in the West Bank, pretty small in number, in solidarity with the Palestinians. In part, in the case of the West Bank, it's been because the Israeli attempt to sever the Gaza politically, spiritually, and so forth from the West Bank succeeded. So if you recall in 1987, when the first Intifada began, it began in Gaza, and almost immediately was then continued in the West Bank. The area was spiritually, politically, it was a united people, and so what happened in Gaza wasn't something alien to, but it was integral to life in the West Bank. Clearly, that didn't happen this time. There were a lot of opportunities to exploit, political opportunities to exploit from the nonviolent resistance in Gaza, all of which, to my understanding, I do follow closely, all of which have been ignored. Take, for example, the UN Human Rights Council report on the Great March of Return. It's been by far the most exhaustive, authoritative, impressive UN report ever published on the Palestine question, at least in the modern incarnation since 1967. And it reached quite devastating conclusions. For the first time, a major UN human rights report stated not that Israel uses disproportionate force, not that Israel uses indiscriminate force. It was the first major human rights document including from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. It was the first document which stated categorically and unequivocally that Israel was intentionally targeting children, medical personnel, journalists, disabled people. That was a huge change in human rights coverage, which ought to have been exploited, ought to have been publicized. It was, as far as I can tell, almost completely ignored. What can be done now? I think it's completely irrelevant at this point to talk about one state, two states. These solutions are not on the table at the moment. So long as the Trump administration is in power and Europe has, as always, decided to do nothing, the only thing that can be worked on now is major immediate demands, such as ending the Israeli blockade of Gaza, which I think is still a realistic demand if there is international support around it. As to the future, I think that we could have a game changer in 2020. There is a realistic possibility, certainly no certainty, but there's a realistic possibility that Jeremy Corbyn will be in power in the UK and Bernie Sanders will be the president of the United States. And that will change a lot. That's a game changer. However, one shouldn't exaggerate how big a change it will be. You take the case of, I won't talk about Corbyn right now, even though I follow his campaign very closely. If you take the case of Bernie Sanders, if you look at the last statements Bernie Sanders made on the Fox News town hall meeting, he began by saying he emphatically supports the state of Israel, emphatically supports Israel's right to exist, emphatically supports Israel's right to have secure borders and peace with its neighbors. However, he said there has to be an even and level playing field and Palestinian rights have to be respected, and that Israel is now, in effect, carrying on like a racist state. That also are the limits that have been established in the Jeremy Corbyn campaign. Israel has to be recognized, Israel has rights, but Palestinians also have rights, and they have equal rights to Israel. That, to me, is the maximum framework one can hope for, even in the possible outcome that Corbyn will be in power in the UK and Bernie Sanders will be the president of the United States. And one might add, and there are many points I could fill in, but you take, for example, the extreme dissenting opinions currently now at play in the U.S. political life. Take the case of Ilhan Omar, the new congresswoman from Minnesota. She had an op-ed in the Washington Post last week, and again, she said clearly, I support two states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. Ilhan Omar, for all of her excellent commentary on the conflict, recognizes that she sits in Congress, and even as she is a dissenting voice within Congress, and even as she is very courageous and steadfast in her dissent, she recognizes the limits of political realities. And one of those limits, as expressed by Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, Bernie Sanders, if he's elected president, and Ilhan Omar as the most militant dissenting voice within Congress, one of those limits is the two states, Israel and Palestine. You may not like those limits. You may wish those limits would vanish with the blink of an eye. You may hope for many things, but they have no connection whatsoever to any...
Dr. Finkelstein, Dr. Finkelstein, it has been 6 minutes. Please, can you come to the conclusion, please?
Excuse me?
Can you come to the conclusion, please?
I concluded.
Yeah, please.
No, I'm done.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, the time left to this session is already over. It is really very important, intellectually very stimulating session. session, I would like to express my feeling of thanks and appreciation once again to the participants and to the floor. I think we all deserve to have a lunch. And see you in the lunch.
Thank you very much. Just 1 second. I want to thank again our presenters for very insightful remarks. And thank you, Dr. Finkelstein, for being with us. Norman's been up since 4 o'clock in the morning, though, if you don't know that. So we really appreciate it, and we hope to see you in person